A fire that took everything, a father who claimed his faith was the only thing left, and a miracle buried deep within the ashes. The morning air was thick with the ghost of smoke. Where a warm two-story house had stood just 12 hours before, now remained only a charred black skeleton groaning under the weight of a grey, unforgiving sky. Yellow caution tape cordoned off the property, a flimsy barrier against a scene of absolute devastation. Neighbors stood on their lawns in somber clusters, speaking in hushed tones, while a local news crew filmed the wreckage. In the middle of it all stood David, his arm wrapped tightly around his wife, Sarah, and their young son, Ben. Soot-stained. His face and his clothes smelled of ash, but his eyes, though filled with a deep sadness, held a strange and steady calm. They had lost everything they owned. Furniture, clothes, photographs, the physical reminders of a lifetime of memories. They had escaped with nothing but their lives and the pajamas they were wearing. Fire Chief Miller, a veteran with a face carved from years of seeing the worst in the world, was giving an interview to a young reporter. He spoke in facts and figures. The cause appears to be an electrical fault in the garage. The fire spread quickly. By the time my team arrived, the structure was fully engulfed. It's a total loss, I'm afraid. The reporter, seeing David and his family, approached them with a microphone. Her expression a careful mix of professional curiosity and sympathy. David, an unimaginable tragedy. How do you even begin to process a loss like this? David looked from the smoldering ruins to his wife and son, and then back at the reporter. He managed a small, weary smile. "We lost our house," he said, his voice quiet but clear. "But we haven't lost our home. Our home is with us, right here. God is with us." Chief Miller, overhearing the comment as he walked past, stopped. He had a look on his face that wasn't malicious, but was filled with a kind of intellectual pity. He gestured subtly toward David. "It's a common psychological response," he explained to the reporter, just loud enough for David to hear. "A coping mechanism. When people suffer a trauma this severe, the mind clings to whatever brings comfort. It's a form of denial. In a few days, when the reality of the situation truly sets in, it will be a different story." The words hung in the air, a clinical and public dismissal of David's faith. It wasn't an attack, but it was a form of humiliation, pitying him, explaining away his belief as a symptom of shock in front of his friends, his neighbors, and a rolling camera. The reporter looked awkwardly between the two men. David's calm expression never wavered. He turned his head slightly to acknowledge the chief. "I appreciate everything you and your men did for us last night, Chief. You are heroes," he said, his tone respectful. "But what you call denial, I call a promise. You see, there are some things that fire cannot touch." Chief Miller simply shook his head slowly, a sad, knowing look in his eyes, as if dealing with a child who refused to accept reality. He clearly thought David was in shock, speaking nonsense born from grief. He didn't know that David's conviction wasn't built on wishful thinking. It was built on a memory, on a secret forged in another fire long ago, a secret that gave him the certainty that even in the heart of this black, smoldering ruin, something sacred had survived. But who was this man who could stand in the ashes of his life and speak of promises? Before he was the subject of a fire chief's pity, he was just David. David was a carpenter. It was a fitting trade for a man of his nature, patient, precise, and someone who found a quiet satisfaction in building things that last. He didn't run a large company. He was a one-man operation, sought after in his small Ohio town for his honest work and the meticulous care he put into every joint and every finish. His hands, calloused and strong, knew the language of wood, and his workshop, which had been in the now-destroyed garage, was his sanctuary. His life with Sarah and Ben was marked by a gentle rhythm. They lived in the house he had spent years renovating himself, a home not of grand design, but of personal touches. Every squeaky floorboard and every crooked picture frame held a story. Their evenings were not filled with the noise of a television, but with the sound of Ben reading aloud, Sarah humming in the kitchen, or David strumming an old guitar on the porch. They were a family grounded not in what they owned, but in who they were to each other. In the community, David was known as a man of his word. If he said he would help a neighbor fix a broken fence, He would be there on Saturday morning, tools in hand. He volunteered at the local church, not by preaching from the pulpit, but by repairing the pews and helping with the food pantry. His faith was like his carpentry, quiet, functional, and built to withstand pressure. It wasn't loud or declarative. It was woven into the fabric of his daily actions. He prayed before every meal, read a chapter from his worn-out Bible every night, and spoke of God's grace with the same simple certainty that he spoke of the hardness of oak. Some found his unwavering belief a little old-fashioned, a bit too simple for a complicated world. They saw a good man, a kind neighbor, but perhaps one who was a little naive, sheltered from the true harshness of life. They couldn't understand how someone could be so untroubled. Chief Miller's assessment in the face of the fire wasn't an isolated opinion. It was a reflection of what many quietly thought. But David's calm wasn't born of ignorance. It was a peace that had been tested. The loss of his home was a devastating blow, a fire that had consumed their material world. But it was not the first fire he had faced, and the quiet strength that allowed him to comfort his family amidst the ruins was not a coping mechanism developed that morning. It was a shield that had been forged in the flames of a far more personal inferno. A night that had burned away everything but the one thing he knew to be indestructible. What no one standing on that lawn could know was that David's calm was not a shield he had just put up. It was a foundation that had been laid 15 years earlier. For David, the smell of smoke and the sight of ashes were not new. He had stood in the ruins of his life once before, in a fire that burned hotter and deeper than any physical flame, a fire that had consumed not just his possessions, but his pride, his trust, and his very soul. 15 years ago, David was not the serene carpenter the town knew today. He was a young man alight with ambition, his hands skilled and his heart full of dreams. His faith then was a comfortable habit, a Sunday morning routine inherited from his parents, but it was not the anchor of his life. The anchor was his best friend, Mark. They had grown up together, inseparable since kindergarten. They learned to fish in the same creek, got into the same trouble, and shared the same dream, to build a business with their own two hands. And they did. D&M Builders was born in David's garage, fueled by youthful energy and a brotherhood that seemed unbreakable. They were a perfect team. David was the craftsman, the artist who could see the soul in a piece of wood. Mark was the salesman, the charmer with a quick smile and a way with words who could win over any client. Their business exploded. In 5 years, they went from fixing broken porch steps to building custom homes. Their company's sign a symbol of quality and success throughout the county. They bought a large workshop, hired a crew, and watched the money roll in. David, for the first time in his life, felt the intoxicating thrill of worldly success. He bought a new truck, started planning a bigger house, and proposed to Sarah, presenting her with a ring far more expensive than he had ever imagined he could afford. But as the business grew, something inside David began to shrink. His quiet moments in the workshop were replaced by late-night meetings. His simple prayers of gratitude became rushed requests for bigger contracts. He started to believe the praise, to see their success not as a blessing, but as the direct result of his own talent and Mark's savvy. He and Mark were unstoppable. They had built this kingdom themselves. God was a silent, distant partner, one he acknowledged out of habit but no longer truly consulted. The first sign of trouble was a shadow, a detail so small David dismissed it. A supplier calling about a late payment. An invoice Mark claimed to have handled but hadn't. Mark was always so reassuring, his smile as easy as ever. "Don't worry about the paperwork, Dave," he'd say, clapping him on the shoulder. "You're the artist. Let me handle the messy stuff. I've got it under control." And David, wanting to believe in the perfect partnership, let him. He trusted his friend, his brother, completely. It was a trust that would lead to his ruin. The collapse didn't happen slowly. It happened all at once, like a dam breaking. It started with a phone call from the bank. A second mortgage had been taken out on their workshop, a loan for $200,000 that David knew nothing about. His Signature was on the paperwork. A forgery so perfect it was chilling. Then came the other calls, suppliers they owed tens of thousands to, an equipment leasing company preparing to repossess their machinery, a line of credit maxed out. Mark was gone. His phone went straight to voicemail. His apartment was empty. He had vanished, taking with him every liquid asset the company had. But he had left the debts, a mountain of them, all legally tied to the business and, by extension, to David. The fire had been smoldering for months, hidden behind Mark's smile and forged documents, and now the entire structure of David's life was engulfed in the flames of betrayal. The days that followed were a blur of shame and disbelief. Lawyers, accountants, and bank managers spoke to him in a language of bankruptcy and liquidation that he couldn't comprehend. He had to lay off his crew, men he considered friends, men with families to feed. He had to face the suppliers, the small business owners in his own town, whom he had looked in the eye and promised to pay. He saw the disappointment and anger in their faces, and it felt like a physical blow. The D&M Builders sign, once a source of immense pride, was taken down. His dream, his kingdom, had turned to ash, but the financial ruin was nothing compared to the inferno raging inside him. The betrayal by Mark was a wound so deep it poisoned everything. He couldn't sleep. He'd lie awake at night, replaying every conversation, every handshake, every shared laugh, searching for the moment the lie had begun. Was it all a lie? Their entire friendship? The shame was a constant companion, a heavy cloak he couldn't take off. He avoided going into town, terrified of meeting the eyes of people he felt he had failed. His relationship with Sarah, his new fiancée, became strained. He was angry, bitter, and closed off. He pushed her away, unable to bear her sympathy, which felt like pity. His prayers became accusations. Why, he would demand of a silent God. Why did you let this happen? I worked so hard. I was a good person. Where were you when he was stealing from me? Where are you now? The silence that answered him only deepened his bitterness. His faith, once a comfortable piece of furniture, was now a pile of smoldering embers. He felt utterly and completely abandoned. The lowest point came on a cold November night, about 6 months after the collapse. He was sitting alone in the cold, dark shell of his original workshop, the garage behind his small rented house. The bank had taken the commercial property. All that was left were his old hand tools and the smell of sawdust, a ghost of his former life. A pile of final notices and letters from collection agencies sat on his workbench. He was financially ruined. His reputation was in tatters, and the friend he had loved like a brother had proven to be a phantom. He had nothing left. He picked up a heavy wooden mallet, his knuckles white. For a wild moment, he wanted to destroy everything, to smash the workbench, to splinter the tools, to reduce what little he had left to rubble. His anger and grief were a physical pressure inside him, screaming for release. He lifted the mallet high over his head, his body trembling with rage, and then he stopped. He didn't know why. But in that moment of absolute brokenness, with the mallet held high, his reflection stared back at him from the dark glass of the window. He saw a man he didn't recognize, a man consumed by a hatred that was destroying him more surely than any debt. And in that instant, something broke. Not the workbench, but the pride inside him. The hard shell of anger and self-pity that he had built around his heart finally cracked. He lowered the mallet, his strength gone. He slid down to the concrete floor, the cold seeping into his bones. And for the first time since it all began, he cried. He wept not for the money or the business, but for the man he had become. He wept for his lost friendship, for his lost trust, and for his lost soul. Sitting there on the dusty floor, surrounded by the ghosts of his ambition, he finally prayed a real prayer. It wasn't a demand or a question, it was a surrender. God, he whispered, his voice hoarse. I can't do this anymore, I'm broken. I have nothing left to offer, I've made a mess of everything. I tried to build my own kingdom and it fell apart. If you are there, if you still care, I'm yours. Whatever is left of me, it's yours. I don't want the money back, I don't want revenge. I just want peace. Show me what to do. Just show me the next step. He didn't see a vision or hear a voice. But as he sat there in the darkness, a profound and inexplicable peace began to settle over him, as gentle as falling snow. The crushing weight on his chest, the weight he had carried for months, began to lift. The fire of his anger and bitterness began to cool, replaced by a quiet warmth. It was not a solution to his problems, but it was a release from them. He felt a quiet assurance, a deep-down knowing that he was no longer alone in the wreckage. Next morning, the world was the same, but David was different. The debt was still there. The legal problems were still there. But the bitterness was gone. He looked at his hands, not as the tools of a failed businessman, but as the hands of a carpenter. He picked up a small block of scrap wood and his carving, knife. And there, in the early morning light, he slowly and carefully carved a small, simple cross. It took him years to pay off the debts. He took on small, humble jobs, working out of his garage again, finding joy not in profit but in the work itself. He and Sarah got married, not with a lavish wedding, but with a simple ceremony in their small church. They built a new life, a stronger life, on a foundation not of success but of faith. He kept that small wooden cross. It sat on his bedside table for 15 years, a constant, tangible reminder of the night his world burned down, and the moment he discovered the only thing that could not be turned to ash. That was the secret he carried in his heart. He had already walked through the fire. He knew what survived. And it was the memory of that night, of the cold concrete floor and the warmth of a peace that passed all understanding, that now gave David the strength to stand calmly in the ashes. Back in the present, under the gray Ohio sky, the fire was out, but the challenge had just begun. Chief Miller had moved on, his dismissal of David's faith hanging in the smoky air. But the news reporter, a young woman named Clara with sharp, intelligent eyes, recognized that the real story wasn't the fire itself, but the man who stood in its aftermath. She moved closer, her microphone held like a probe. "A promise?" she prompted, her journalistic instincts sensing a deeper narrative. "What do you mean by that? What could possibly survive a fire of that intensity? The chief seems to think it's a total loss." The neighbors, who had been watching with sympathetic sadness, now drew nearer, their hushed conversations turning into a collective, focused silence. They had always known David as a steady, quiet man. Now, hearing him speak of untouchable things amidst such total destruction, they couldn't help but wonder if the chief was right. Was this the beginning of a breakdown? Was David's simple faith, which seemed so strong in the calm of everyday life, finally cracking under a weight too heavy to bear? Sarah squeezed her husband's arm, her own eyes filled with tears and a growing uncertainty. She trusted David's faith with all her heart, but this loss was so absolute, so final. She looked at the blackened heap that had been their home, the place where they had tucked their son into bed just last night, and found it hard to see anything but a devastating ending. "David," she whispered, her voice trembling slightly. "Maybe we should just go. We can stay with my sister. There's nothing left for us here." David looked down at her and then at his son, Ben, who was clutching his mother's leg, his small face a mask of confusion and fear. He knew he had to be strong for them, but this wasn't just a performance of strength. This was a moment of testimony. He had made a promise to God in that cold, dark workshop 15 years ago that he would be a witness, that he would tell the story of God's faithfulness. Now was the time to honor that vow. He took a deep breath, the scent of wet ash filling his lungs. "Chief Miller," he called out, his voice calm but firm, carrying across the lawn with surprising authority. The chief, who was directing some of his crew, turned around, a flicker of irritation on his face at being interrupted. "You said that in a few days, reality would set in," David continued, his tone respectful but unwavering. "And that my faith is just a way to cope with trauma. I understand why you think that. You see what was lost, but I'd like to show you what was saved." A skeptical, almost weary look crossed the chief's face. He was a man who dealt in the hard facts of physics and chemistry, of flashpoints and accelerants. "Son," he said, his voice patient but unmistakably condescending, "I've been doing this job for 30 years. I've walked through hundreds of fires, from small kitchen flare-ups to multi-story infernos. When a fire burns that hot, For that long, nothing is saved. Wood turns to ash, metal warps, glass melts. Your roof collapsed. The second floor is gone. That's the reality. That's the science of it. I understand the science, Chief, David replied evenly, meeting his gaze without flinching. I work with wood. I know what fire does to it. But there's another principle at work here. And I'm not asking you to believe me without proof. I'm asking you to see for yourself. The challenge was so quiet, so devoid of anger or arrogance, that it was utterly disarming. It wasn't a demand. It was an invitation. The news camera zoomed in, capturing the silent standoff between the man of science and the man of faith. The neighbors leaned in, forgetting their own morning routines, captivated by the unfolding drama. This was no longer just a tragic house fire. It was a public test of something far more fundamental. David turned to one of the firefighters standing nearby, a burly man named Johnson, whose face was smudged with soot. "Excuse me," David said politely. "I know it's not standard procedure and the structure is dangerous, but would it be possible for you to escort me to one specific spot in the house? I won't go far. I know exactly where it is. It's the back wall of our bedroom on the first floor. I won't touch anything. I just need you to look." The firefighter glanced at Chief Miller, awaiting his command. The chief hesitated, a flash of annoyance warring with his professional duty. This was a waste of time and a safety risk. The structure was unstable and he had a job to do, but the camera was rolling. Clara, the reporter, had her microphone pointed directly at him. The entire neighborhood was watching. To refuse now would make him look petty and inflexible, as if he were afraid of being proven wrong, however impossible that seemed. With a heavy, exasperated sigh, he gave a curt nod. "All right, fine," he said, his voice clipped with authority. "Johnson, go with him, but hard hats on, and be quick. 2 minutes in and out. I don't want anyone getting hurt over this, whatever this is." As the firefighter handed David a yellow hard hat and led him past the caution tape, a profound hush fell over the crowd. Every eye was fixed on the two figures carefully navigating the treacherous landscape of charred beams and soggy, blackened debris. They were walking into a tomb of memories, a place of total destruction. But David walked with the steady, certain steps of a man who knew he was about to find not an ending, but a testament. The silence on the lawn was absolute. The crowd watched, their skepticism mixed with a reluctant, undeniable curiosity. The camera held its focus. They were all waiting for the anticlimax, the moment when David's strange conviction would inevitably collide with the stark black reality of the ruin. Navigating the wreckage was like walking through a nightmare landscape. The firefighter Johnson moved with practiced care, testing each step, his eyes scanning the precarious structure above. David followed closely, his gaze fixed not on the devastation around him, but on a specific point in his mind's eye. The air inside the skeletal remains of the house was thick with the acrid smell of burnt plastic, wet ash, and lost memories. The once familiar layout was gone, replaced by a chaotic jumble of charred timber and twisted metal. Walls had collapsed, furniture had been reduced to unrecognizable heaps of black dust, and a slurry of water and soot covered everything. It was a scene of complete and utter annihilation. They made their way to what had been the back of the house. Johnson stopped, holding out a hand to halt David. "This is it," the firefighter said, his voice muffled by his gear. "The rear wall of the master bedroom, or what's left of it. Be careful, the whole section is unstable." The scene before them was one of the most intense destruction. This was where the roof had caved in, bringing the second floor down with it. A massive, blackened support beam lay diagonally across the room, and everything beneath it was crushed or incinerated. The drywall on the wall in front of them was gone, burned away to reveal the charred studs behind it. The heat had been so intense here that it had melted the metal frame of a window and blistered the paint on the house next door. This was the heart of the inferno. Chief Miller, watching from the lawn, spoke into his radio. "Johnson, what do you see?" "It's just like you said, Chief," Johnson's voice crackled back. "Total devastation. Nothing but charcoal and debris. We're coming out." "Wait," David said, his voice calm but firm. He pointed to a small section of the wall near the floor, partially obscured by a fallen piece of drywall. There. Can you shine? Your light right there. Johnson let out a sigh, clearly wanting this to be over, but he complied. He aimed the powerful beam of his flashlight at the spot David indicated. The light cut through the gloom, illuminating a small 4-foot section of the wall. At first it looked the same as the rest, black, scorched and ruined. But as Johnson held the light steady, something became clear. The charring on this small section was different. It was a surface blackening, but the wood beneath it seemed intact. "Chief," Johnson's voice on the radio had lost its bored tone. "You're going to want to see this. I don't understand." Intrigued, Chief Miller took a few steps forward, peering intently from behind the caution tape. The reporter, Clara, followed, her cameraman zooming in as tightly as he could. "What is it, David?" Sarah called out, her voice trembling with a mixture of fear and a new fragile hope. David didn't answer. He just looked at the firefighter. "Could you please clear away that piece of drywall?" With a hesitant look, Johnson used the toe of his heavy boot to nudge the fallen, soggy piece of wallboard aside. It crumbled away, revealing the small section of the wall more clearly. The crowd on the lawn gasped. Clara, the reporter, lowered her microphone for a second, her professional composure momentarily forgotten. On that wall, in a small, perfect rectangle of about 2 feet by 3 feet, the wood was not burned, was pristine. While everything around it, the studs, the floorboards, the debris, was blackened to a crisp, this one area looked as if the fire had simply passed over it, as if it had been protected by an invisible shield. The wood grain was clear, the color a warm natural brown. It was so untouched, so completely preserved amidst the surrounding devastation, that it looked supernatural. And in the very center of this untouched rectangle of wood, hanging on a small, simple nail, was an object. It was a small hand-carved wooden cross. The cross itself was also perfect. Not a scorch mark, not a hint of soot, not a single sign that it had endured the blistering 1,000-degree heat of the fire. It hung there, serene and undisturbed, in the very heart of the ruin. It was the cross David had carved in his garage 15 years ago, on the morning after he had surrendered everything to God. He had hung it on their bedroom wall the day they moved into the house, as a private reminder of his covenant. It was a symbol of his lowest point and of his greatest discovery. Johnson, the firefighter, a man who had seen everything, simply stared, his mouth slightly agape. He reached out a gloved hand and gently touched the wood of the wall around the cross. It was cold. He then touched the charred stud right next to it. It was still warm. The line between the burned and unburned wood was so sharp, so defined, it defied all logic, all science. Fires don't burn in perfect rectangles. They don't stop for no reason. Chief Miller stood frozen on the lawn. The principles of thermodynamics, of heat transfer, of combustion, his entire professional knowledge, could not explain what he was seeing on the camera's zoomed-in feed. There was no scientific explanation, no rational reason. It was simply impossible. David looked at the cross and a slow, peaceful smile spread across his face. It was not a smile of triumph or of "I told you so." It was a smile of profound, quiet gratitude, the confirmation of a promise kept. He turned his head and looked out towards the chief, the reporter, and his neighbors. He didn't need to say a word. The proof was there, hanging on the wall, a silent, irrefutable testament to the one thing that fire could not touch. But while everyone on that lawn stared at the impossible sight, expecting David to declare his victory, to point to the cross as proof of his righteousness, he did something that no one anticipated. He simply bowed his head. The image on the news camera was unwavering, broadcasting the surreal scene to anyone watching the local morning news. A perfect, untouched cross hanging in the heart of a ruin. The reporter, Clara, finally found her voice, though it was little more than a whisper. "Chief Miller, what are we looking at? How is that possible?" Chief Miller, a man who always had a quick, confident answer based on years of experience, was silent for a long moment. He shook his head, not in denial, but in pure, unadulterated disbelief. "I don't know," he said, the admission costing him a visible effort. "I have no explanation. In 30 years, I've never seen anything like it." His voice lacked its usual commanding tone. It was the voice of a man whose understanding of the world had just been fundamentally broken. The firefighter Johnson slowly backed away from the wall, his eyes never leaving the cross. He made his way back to David, his usual gruff demeanor gone, replaced by a look of profound respect. "We should go," he said quietly. "It's not safe." As David and the firefighter emerged from the wreckage and stepped back onto the green grass of the lawn, it was as if they were returning from another world. The crowd parted for them, their faces a mixture of shock, awe, and a newfound reverence for the quiet carpenter they thought they knew. Sarah ran to David, her tears no longer of sorrow, but of overwhelming gratitude and wonder. She threw her arms around him, burying her face in his chest. "I saw it, David," she sobbed. "I saw it. I never should have doubted." David held her close, his own eyes misty. "It's all right," he whispered. "It's not about doubting, it's about remembering." He then looked over at Chief Miller, who had walked forward to meet them, his face a mask of confusion. The chief looked from David to the smoking remains of the house and back again. I owe you an apology," Miller said, the words heavy and awkward. "What I said before, about denial, about coping mechanisms, I was wrong. I spoke out of turn. I can't explain what's in there, but I know what I see." David offered him a gentle, forgiving smile. "You don't owe me an apology, Chief. You were speaking from your experience, from your knowledge, and you were right. Fire does destroy. It turns wood to ash and metal to liquid. That is the truth of this world." He paused, letting his words sink in, his gaze sweeping over his neighbors and the news crew. "But there is another truth," he continued, his voice resonating with a quiet authority that captivated everyone. "There are things that are not of this world. That cross isn't special because of the wood it's made from. It's special because of what it represents. It represents a promise that even when everything we build for ourselves is burned to the ground, even when we are left with nothing but ashes, we are not alone. It's a sign that God's presence is a shield that the fiercest flames of this life cannot penetrate." He wasn't gloating, he wasn't preaching. He was simply explaining, sharing the core of his belief with a humility that was far more powerful than any sermon. "What you saw on that wall wasn't a magic trick," he said, his eyes finding the chief's again. "It was a reminder for me and maybe for all of us, that our true foundation isn't built on wood and nails but on faith. That's the one thing that can't be taken from us." He looked at the ruins of his house one last time, not with sadness, but with acceptance. The fire had taken their possessions, but it had given them something far greater in return, a visible, tangible testament to an invisible, intangible reality. It had turned their personal tragedy into a public parable, a lesson not of loss, but of what truly endures. Those words, spoken not in triumph but in quiet truth, did more than the fire to change the atmosphere on that street. The mask of professional detachment on Chief Miller's face had completely crumbled, replaced by a raw and honest humility. He stood before David, no longer a figure of authority talking down to a victim, but as one man before another, grappling with a truth that transcended his understanding. "A reminder," the chief repeated softly, as if tasting the word for the first time. "All my life I've focused on putting out fires, on saving what's tangible, walls, roofs, possessions. Maybe I've been looking at it all wrong." He looked around at the crowd of neighbors, then at the news camera and finally back at David. He knew this moment was bigger than just one house fire. "David," he said, his voice now firm but with a new tone of sincerity, "your family has lost everything. The city has emergency funds and the community will rally, I know they will. But I want to do more. I'll personally lead a team of off-duty firefighters. We're builders too in our own way. We will rebuild this house for you. No cost. Consider it a debt of gratitude for the lesson you've taught us all this morning." The offer was stunning, a spontaneous act of immense generosity from a man known for his by-the-book pragmatism. The neighbors began to applaud, and several stepped forward immediately, offering their own help, their own skills, their own homes in the interim. The tragedy had transformed into a powerful moment of community and grace. David was visibly moved. his eyes welling up with tears of gratitude. He shook the chief's hand, a firm, heartfelt grip. "Chief, that is the most generous offer I have ever heard," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "And we accept your help with all our hearts." "But not for free." Chief Miller looked confused. "What do you mean? You've lost everything. You're in no position to—" David interrupted him gently. "You're right, we don't have money to offer, but we have something else. Let's rebuild it together. You and your men, me and my tools, our neighbors. Let's not just rebuild a house. Let's build a community. Let's make this project a testament to what we all learned today. We'll call it the Carpenter's Project, and when we're done with our house, we'll find another family in need. And then another." He turned to the news reporter. Clara, who was watching, captivated. "You wanted a story," David said to her. "The real story isn't about what was destroyed here today, it's about what's about to be built." A powerful shift occurred in that moment. The focus moved from the miracle of the past to a mission for the future. David, in his moment of vindication, didn't ask for anything for himself. Instead, he immediately turned the blessing outward, multiplying it into an opportunity for everyone to participate in the grace they had just witnessed. He took the astonishing offer and made it bigger, more inclusive, more meaningful. Chief Miller stared at David, a slow smile spreading across his face. He saw it clearly now. David's strength wasn't just a passive faith that withstood tragedy. It was an active, creative force that redeemed it. It took the ashes of a disaster and immediately began to build something new and beautiful from them. "The Carpenter's Project," the chief said, nodding his head with a newfound sense of purpose. "I like the sound of that. You've got yourself a deal, David, and a crew." As David, Sarah, and Ben were led away by neighbors to a warm house and a hot breakfast, they left behind a scene that was no longer one of loss. The yellow caution tape still cordoned off a ruin, but it no longer felt like an ending. It felt like the groundbreaking ceremony for a new beginning. The story of the fire and the untouched cross became a local legend, but it was the story of what happened next that truly changed the town. The Carpenter's Project became a reality. Firefighters, carpenters, neighbors, and strangers worked side by side, and David's house was rebuilt, not just with wood and nails, but with love and a shared sense of purpose. And as promised, when their home was finished, they didn't stop. The project continued, becoming a beacon of hope in the community, rebuilding lives as well as houses. David never sought the spotlight. He returned to his work, a humble carpenter, whose greatest lesson was taught not with words, but with a quiet, unwavering faith. The fire took his home, but it revealed his foundation. It showed him, and everyone who witnessed it, that while the things of this world can turn to ash in a moment, a life built on God's promises has a strength that no fire can ever consume.